smoky dog days of summer here in the Mountain West. We are overrun with smoke from wildfires out in California, and we had the dubious distinction not all that long ago, maybe yesterday or the day before, as being the worst air in the world. Lucky us. So anyway, that's where we're at, and that's how we're going to do things today. I'm safely inside, doing everything I can to avoid the tasks that I'm supposed to be getting done. And I'm sure there are a number of people out there that can relate to that tendency of mine. So let me introduce myself. I am Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host. You are listening to the Psych Monologues, which is a podcast exploring the intersection of faith and psychology and spiritual formation. So here we go. School is coming, cranking up for all the activities and all the things that I have to do in order to get ready for students to come back and teach them and fill their heads full of mush with profound truths. Maybe just truth. I don't know about profundity, but it is that. So what I want to talk about today is a concept or a descriptor that I've used before, and it is starts out, the way I want to start this thing out is introducing you to this, and I think a lot of people out there that are Trekkies versus Star Wars people will relate, or at least know or understand what I'm talking about, because in the original Star Trek introduction, and that's 1966 to 69 is when the TV series actually ran. It starts with William Shatner's voice over, and you see this scene of Enterprise entering the picture, and he says, "Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of Starship Enterprise." And he goes on to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Now, all of the Trekkies out there were probably mouthing it with me as I got farther into it. Thank you very much, William Shatner. But, ironically, there's a lot about that actually is quite contemporary with how we live life today. It has a lot to do with everyday life. As a matter of fact, when you walk away from this or this podcast, or you interact with anybody today or whatever, check it out and just see if what I'm talking about isn't true. Because there are at least 3 spaces. All right. Now, I know he was talking about space, this out there space, the final frontier. But I think we live in spaces a lot. And there are at least 3 that I can think of that are worth paying attention to and talking about that. And they all matter to us. As a matter of fact, they matter so much that sometimes we spend more time in some spaces than others. And the first one is the space that is in our own heads. In between our ears. That internal space is one of those places that we live in. And a lot of people, in a lot of cases, when we would describe introverts, they like to live in their heads. They like the world of ideas. They get lost there. I get lost there regularly. And if I'm lucky, I find my way out and interact with the real world. So there's that space inside of our heads within us. And then there's a space within the other person that I'm talking to, if there is a person that I'm talking to. Now, there may not be. But how many times have you walked into a retail store of whatever sort, you have an interaction with somebody, and you're reflecting, and here's the space in your own head. You're reflecting on the interaction you had, and you thought, yeah, man, I came off kind of rude. And that's the space in your head. That's when you are reflecting and going back over, which is something is very unique to us as humans, and going back over and saying, I think that I probably could have done that better, and I'm going to purpose to do it better the next time. The next thought after that is, I wonder what the other person thought. And that's the space in their head. What they are thinking, what they are perceiving, what they are concluding about my interactions with them and their opinion of me. And this is another space that we live in a lot of ways. The last one is the one that I would suggest to you is probably equally dangerous as the one within our heads and the one in the other person's head, whatever. And that's the space between us. See, that in a lot of cases, and I've seen this in talking to people over the years, is they are oftentimes most concerned with the space in the other person's head. In other words, what kind of thoughts, what kind of things they're thinking, concluding, etc. And they actually will fashion the things they have to say so as to impact that space in the other person's head. Now, I think we all can agree that if I were to do a poll as any of my students walk out of the classes at the end of August and we've started up and say, how much control do you have? And in most cases, people will say, I don't have very much control really at all over what other people think. Now, that's a fact. I think clearly we have some impact, but we have no control over that. And that's a fact. But we are really good at facts, but we separate them from the feelings that actually give them substance. And feelings are the things that drive our over concern with what's going on in somebody else's head to such a point that we'll change what we say, or we'll even go so far as to not say anything at all in order to impact what that other person thinks about us. Now, there is one fatal thing missing in all of that, and that is, one, we don't know. I think everybody I talk to, myself included, would say, I don't know. I don't know what they're thinking. As a matter of fact, humans are so complex in their thinking, they could be thinking one thing or cogitating on one thing and looking at me as if they're listening to me and not be thinking at all about what I'm saying. Now, that doesn't make them self-absorbed or selfish or anything like that, but that's the wonder of how we think. That's the very thing that kind of caught my attention and fascination to go into psychology at all, is our marvelous complexity at being able to multitask. Everybody does. That we're thinking about one thing in our heads while we're talking and interacting with another person who's in front of us. And it's divided, granted. I mean, I think in a lot of cases we would say that when we're very present with somebody, we're probably closed the back office and we've focused all of our attentional energy toward the person who's right in front of us, and that is what makes us present. And most of the time, people recognize that. Most of the time, people sense how present you are with them versus being distracted by the other trains of thought. And it might be a pretty complex train system, but other trains of thought that are going on. So we have these three different spaces: the space in your head, the space in the other person's head, and the space between us. And as I said, I think outside of the space of the other person's head, I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but I think probably something every bit as dangerous as the space out there is the space between us. And the reason I say that is because how little time, oftentimes, how little time we spend in that space between us for one main reason. The risk increases logarithmically when I come out and live in the space between me and another person. The things I have to say, vulnerability, I'll take a sidetrack here for a second, but vulnerability happens in the space between us. Vulnerability doesn't happen in your head. It doesn't happen in the other person's head. It happens in the space between us, and that's exactly why oftentimes we we don't like spending a whole lot of time there, because when you look at the word vulnerability, it means in the Latin, vulneros means capable of being wounded. So we walk out into the space between us, meet each other there, and there is the threat of being wounded. Now, there is also the threat of being touched and impacted and somebody being present, and then that invites us to be present with ourselves, and it gets really very dynamic out there in that space between us. Ironically, in a lot of cases, that's exactly what counseling and therapists are skilled at doing, is they're skilled at inviting us out into the space between us and them and saying, all right, lay it out. Let's see what it actually looks like. Not how you're trying to create it to be, but what it actually looks like. And so in a lot of cases, William Shatner was more true than he knew, and maybe Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was more true than he knew, because space is the final frontier, except it's the space between us that is the final frontier. What do we do? I mean, how do we move into that space? And granted, I would suggest to you that part of the reason that our relationships often suffer is because it is what I am thinking about the other person, interacting with them in my head, and what the other person is doing, interacting with me in their head. And then when we meet in the space between us, it's not really real time. It's all of the conclusions and assumptions and hurts and thoughts and everything else that have been accumulated in the space in our heads that now we bring with us into this space, and it clutters it. It clutters it. And suddenly we begin to fight over the conclusions we've already made about the other person in our head, rather than allowing them to speak for themselves, him or herself. And I can tell you how this happens to me. This has happened to me as a counselor. This has happened to me as a teacher. That it isn't uncommon for me to look at somebody that I'm talking to and say, it sounds like you've been interacting with me in your head. Now, is there going to become a point in time where I get to speak for myself? Now, we don't usually have people in our lives that are quite that courageous or rude, whichever depends on however you want to phrase that, to actually point out how much time I have been relating to the person in my head, and I have robbed them of their voice to speak for themselves. And see, that's what makes the space between us so dangerous, because they get to speak for themselves. Now, the problem is, of course, is that we bring all of our filters with us from the internal dialogues we've been having with them, which makes it very difficult to actually have a conversation or a dialogue with them at all, right? I mean, I will often diagram what communication looks like, and in a very rudimentary way, you have somebody who's the speaker and you have somebody who's the listener, and the communication between them, otherwise known as a message, usually comes with two components. And again, this is very rudimentary, but the two components are content or facts, and the other component is affect or feelings. It comes with both. Now, there are different proportions coming at me from the other person. If they're the speaker, there's different proportions are coming at me. If it's all completely factual, there's hardly any feelings in there, because it's a conveyance of information to me, okay? So if you've got it in your head, you got a little stick person and I'm holding up my left hand here. My left hand is the speaker, my right hand is the listener. The message between them comes through, and we think, bam, I've got it. Mic drop. That's what communication is. But what is missing is a barrier on both sides of that formula. The barrier for the speaker are the filters that he or she has accumulated, not only in the relationship with the person they're talking to, but also in their relationships in general, whether that's culture that they come from or family or whatever that would be. So that filter stands between whatever comes out of their mouth and whatever gets conveyed to the other person. And that's true for the listener as well. There's a filter there. And filters have a way of filtering out, taking out whatever they're filtering out. I mean, we're all pretty familiar with filtering, right? We do the searches on Google and other places, and we say, I want to find out something about the Volkswagen Beetle. That filters out all about the Oldsmobile or a Buick, okay? But we do that in our communication, and that's the danger of the spaces in our heads and what we bring with us into the space between us. Because that filter creates what we in psychology we call a confirmation bias. In other words, I am looking for evidence to confirm what I have already concluded. That's what it's all about. And everybody has experienced this. You go into a car dealership and find no cars because of the supply chains have gotten jacked up. But let's just say, for the sake of example, you go in, you've been shopping online, you've got your idea for the ideal car you want to buy, and you finally find it at a dealership, and you're in love with it, and some people name it whatever, whatever, and you drive it off the lot, and suddenly, to your horror, there are lots and lots of other cars just like yours. And why is that? Because your attention has gotten turned to the car that you bought, and suddenly you go out into the world and begin to look for cars like your own, and the confirmation bias occurs. And this happens in relationships, this happens a lot of places, but that's what happens, and that's how the space between us gets cluttered. Because the confirmation bias, I can have a very, very long conversation with somebody based on my knowledge of them, which is flawed, very flawed. And then when I interact with them, I've already contaminated the pool of my ability to relate to them as they are, not as I've made them to be in my head. And the same thing is true with the other person. So what you have is that when we meet with all of this head trash coming along with us about the other person, when we meet in this space between us, it blows up. And little wonder that it blows up, because now we're warring over our conclusions rather than actually being present with the other person and what they are actually saying. And that's exactly where the danger lies. And that is exactly why the space between us is not only dangerous, but also remarkably, potentially healing and redemptive if we can enter it letting loose of the expectations and the conclusions and the assumptions that we've made about the other person, and seeing through the trash to be able to see them for what they are actually saying and feeling and so forth. So the space between us is probably the most dangerous space we live in. And how do we move into this is the key. Now, let me add another dimension to it, since the Psych Monologues is really about, like I say at the beginning, the intersection of psychology and faith and spiritual formation. Interestingly enough, we do exactly the same thing in the space between us and God. We have already our conclusions about God and the way he's doing things, or how he's not doing things right, or whatever that might be. And so when we go to a conversation with him, we bring all of that with us, and we fill in. Even if we take the time to read Scripture, we fill in all that stuff into his character and who he is, how he is, what he does, what he should do, all of those sorts of things. one of the obstacles to our spiritual formation, engaging in this thing that we talk about, or I talk about in terms of the spiritual journey, is interacting with God as he is, not God made in my image. Blaise Pascal once said, God made man in his own image, and man returned the favor. And more often than not, the times that we spend in interacting with God is the God of our own making, based on our own assumptions and everything else. If I don't take the time to do some reflecting about what's going on in my head, the things that I bring with me. Hang on a second, I gotta take a drink. That I bring with me, then I will continue to assume that the truth of God is contained in my head rather than revealed by him. And I'm interacting with a God of my own making, which brings with it all sorts of contamination, including what his intentions are toward us, and what my willingness to, how far out I am willing to trust him based on what I don't know. Not what I do know, but what I don't know. And that comes into the conversation, I think, ultimately, when we're looking at learning to live in the space between us. It takes a remarkable amount of courage to do that, quite honestly. I have seen it happen time and time again in counseling. I have seen it in journals that have been written for me. I have seen it in a variety of contexts of the courage that it takes to come out into the space between me and God, or me and the other person, drop my hands and drop my head trash as well, and say, this is me as I am. It is probably one of the more courageous things that we can possibly do. And remember, courage isn't always heroism. Courage is speaking fully from one's heart, and that's the definition that I'm operating from here. So moving into this space, knowing full well that it is wrought with danger to upset my sense of control, to upset my sense of safety, upset my sense of certainty, all of those things. It will upset. It's dangerous for that reason. It's not necessarily my life is going to be threatened out there, but my emotional life might, and even my spiritual life might, because I have constructed a house of cards, and I go out there, whether that's into my relationship with God or into my relationship with another person, with my house of cards built on all of the assumptions, and it takes very little to knock it down, because the person acts out of character, or God does something I didn't expect him to do, or worse yet, God doesn't do what I expect him to do. Then I am in a place where now what do? Will I lean into trust, or will I run back to the world of control? Because ultimately, those are the two big choices, whether that's in my relationship with God or with somebody else. Am I going to trust that what they say is true? Now, there are plenty of people in our world who shouldn't be accorded that trust, because they have not acted in accordance with that. And that's reasonable. That is a good thing to do. On the other hand, ironically, and I'm sure you've heard it said before, is why is it that we always hurt the people closest to us? Because they are the most dangerous people. They have the most, I have the most at stake with them, and them with me. And so how we manage trust, one way to manage trust is to push it away, or to take it for granted, or any number of things that come with that. So there's a lot to this picture of what does it mean to live in the space between us. And it's there that growth and healing and redemption And remarkable connection, which is what we were designed for, can actually happen. Now, we will never, and I don't say never often, but we will never continuously experience that there. But the glimpses we have end up being glimpses of glory, of the kind of connection that God designed us to have. And those people are redemptive people in our lives that actually give us an opportunity to sense what that is supposed to look like. Because the reality is, in when Jesus was walking around on the earth, there was no place safer to be than in the space between him and the other person. And oftentimes he was calling them out of that space in their heads so they could live in the space with him and find out that actually God doesn't hate them. Jesus doesn't condemn them. He just wants to be with them. And that would be the challenge for all of us, even in our relationships, right? Is to move into that space and just simply be with the person rather than try to repair something or to fix something or to help somehow or whatever. And that seems simplistic. That might even sound impossible. But oftentimes our efforts at trying to fix things is not really for the person. It's for us because we feel so helpless. And that's the bottom line. We don't like feeling helpless. Who does, right? Because what? We're vulnerable. So maybe in the other person's vulnerability, instead of rushing to try to slap a platitude on it or say the profound thing that will get them out of it or whatever, finding our own way to just enter into that space and be present. And I honestly believe the Holy Spirit will guide you into that if you lean into that trust rather than racking your brain. Because remember, the minute you start racking your brain, you're not focusing on the person who's in front of you. Instead of racking your brain for what to say or how to be helpful, just be present. It sounds, to some, if they're really honest, awful. But to the person who's in pain, it's nice to know we're not alone. And that is very much a part of that. So, a few thoughts for a new week. I'm going to be moving the date of the podcast release to a Monday instead of a Sunday so that I can maintain some integrity for my instituting of a day of rest on Sunday. So it will start coming out on Mondays. I am really excited coming up of a guest I'll be interviewing, and that will be forthcoming in the months to come. If you have questions or reactions, please DM me on Instagram or on the website or comment or any way that you want to. If you want to subscribe or you know somebody who might be interested in some of the stuff that I'm talking about, have them subscribe on the website at drmitch.com. They can find us and follow me on Instagram at the Psych Monologues, Facebook, ray.mitch, and LinkedIn, drmitch are all outlets, social media platforms that I am on. If you would like to, or anyone else that you know would like to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us on any of the platforms that you consume podcasts on: Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Podbean, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. We can all be found there. If you would like to partner with me in funding a scholarship fund for students going on silent retreats at CCU, please hit the website, drmitch.com, go to CCU, drop down menu to the silent retreats, and you will see a donation button. Your gifts are tax deductible, and it would make it possible for a student who doesn't have the funds to be able to engage the silent retreats that we have scheduled for this upcoming year. We have 3 coming up, and the dates are all on the website. There's one in October, one in November, and then another one in April. So if you would like to partner with us, you can do that. If you'd rather write a check, you can do that as well. You can contribute through check. Just make your checks out to 1615.tv, P.O. Box 1777, Castle Rock, Colorado 80104. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me for a few moments of your time to consider what it looks like to live in the space between us. I hope you have a great week. And as always, love you. Later. Bye.